College football nerds here talking crazy week 6 action. Some of it was a little quiet during the day, and then things got a little nutty as we went on. We're going to talk about it. Texas and Oklahoma. We're going to get into Texas A&M and Alabama. I want to remind y'all, please like and subscribe. Helps us out a ton. You're going to hear us reference probably a little bit of our own statistics, our own model from collegefootballnerds.com that you can try out yourself. It's free. Also, hey, our top 25 that the nerds are contributing to, and not just us nerds, you nerds, had over 350 people contribute last week. Again, free to sign up and participate. It's better than the AP poll, y'all, and y'all need to get in on that and help us make it even better. All right, Josh, Texas-Oklahoma was a great game. And I want to start out by saying, because we talked about this in the preview, neither one of these teams should have felt bad if they came out of this game with a loss. I think the only way you could feel bad is if it was a blowout or you looked really ugly. Texas looked a little clunky in the beginning, but all the things that went wrong for them, they lost the game. But Josh, let's just get this out of the way before we give a lot of credit to Oklahoma, which we will in this discussion. Texas's playoff hopes are completely not disrupted by this. They're still in the hunt because, in my opinion, the way the landscape's going, it looks like a conference champion from the Big 12 is going to be in the playoffs.
Yeah, I think the Big 12 champion, unless they slip up again, is probably going to be in the playoff. And look, Texas having that win at Alabama is going to carry a lot of weight. With Alabama having beaten the two teams they've beaten, and we'll touch on the A&M game later. That game is going to carry dividends through the rest of the year. And we've kind of forgotten, because it's been so SEC-centric, how important it is to win those games. Well, if you're a Big 12 fan or a Big 10 fan and, Pac-12 fan, whatever, and you've been poo-pooing those results for years, well, now you get the benefit of it. I mean, there's reality when you win those games in the opener, and that does give you a little bit of a mulligan over, a one-loss non-champion Georgia or something. If Alabama runs the table, wins the SEC, it's really hard to put in one-loss Georgia over a one-loss Texas. I don't see any way you could possibly do that.
So another kind of just diving into this game, Oklahoma was a bit of a question mark. And I mentioned the reason I picked Texas A&M, Texas to win, but not to cover. You picked Oklahoma. The model had the game 35 to 29.4 or something, Oklahoma. The model was super high on Oklahoma all year, but that also means they were very high on Texas, or it was very high on Texas. My takeaway from this game is we know a good bit more about Oklahoma than we did, and it's probably that those two games that I called out for them kind of sleepwalking, SMU and Cincinnati, probably just wasn't a representative of them and who they are, because they could turn it on when they need to. We see that with a lot of teams like this. Given that the game went the way it did, how do you feel about where you slot Oklahoma now versus where you saw them heading into this game? I know AP has already come out. I think they're number 5 or whatever. Talk about where you had them coming into this game and where you have them now if you were doing a top 10.
I had them around in the top 5. I mean, I don't know that I'd ever really pinned it down, but I'd had them in the top 5 or top 6. I thought they were horribly underranked, and I didn't understand why some teams, especially given overall performances and competition level, were necessarily ranked so much higher. And that's still where I'm at. They've played better, in my opinion, than Georgia to this point. There's a whole discussion here on the rankings, and I pulled it up a second ago because I wanted to note, you got Georgia at number 1, you got Michigan at number 2, Ohio State 3, Florida State 4, Oklahoma at 5. Do any, your opinion, Daniel, do any of the 4 teams in front of them have a better win than Oklahoma does right now?
No, you can't say that at all.
Do you think any of those 4 teams in front of them have been consistently better than Oklahoma on a game in and game out basis?
That's tough because of, needing 14 points in the fourth quarter to cover 28-11 versus SMU. I'd say that's not a great look. Same thing with the Cincinnati game, not a great look. So overall, I would say, look, Oklahoma has proved all they need to prove in terms of their overall resume because of this game, but they have had some inconsistencies along the way.
So with all that said, Oklahoma did not get a single first-place vote. Georgia got 50, Michigan got 11, Ohio State got 1, and Florida State got 1. Florida State nearly lost to Boston College. Florida State ended up blowing out late. I'll note blew out LSU. I don't know that LSU. Would you agree with me? I don't know that LSU is a particularly good team. LSU sitting there at 22nd. Texas A&M was unranked last week and now is barely receiving votes. I think that's a little silly, personally, just where they have them in the SEC West, because right now I think a decent shot I'd pick Texas A&M to beat LSU. I don't understand why Oklahoma is still behind Florida State. I can sort of get Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, though that has more on potential than anything, and I know Georgia just throttled Kentucky, which was a big deal. Now, our model had Kentucky way over Georgia. We always said that we thought that was... We didn't do a video on it, but we've said repeatedly we thought that was an example of it being off its rocker and overreacting to the Florida game. But, yeah, it doesn't make sense to me why Oklahoma's only 5. We took a Texas team that I think was, top... what were they? 3rd, and we dropped them all the way to 9th, and then Oklahoma only goes up to 5th. So it's the typical AP poll thing where we can, we can only bump you up for winning, and we can only drop somebody else. We thought Texas was 3rd. Oklahoma proves to be better than Texas. So what we're going to do is make Oklahoma 5th, and then make Texas really low. It's comically stupid. If Texas really was the 3rd best team in the country or close to it, and Oklahoma beat them, then they're better than the teams like Florida State that were formerly behind Texas. Nor do I think Texas really necessarily needed to drop as far as they did.
Yeah, and I think the frustrating thing for me is, we want to encourage playing, and I know this is a game you have to play, right? This is not the Oklahoma-Georgia game that was scheduled at the beginning of the year that I want to remind everybody, said it on Twitter, not either team's fault. They wanted to play that game. Would have been awesome in hindsight if we had that data point. I'm just saying, it really shows how important those games are.
And that's a TV thing people need to understand, because Fox would have gotten a contract for one game, and there would have been no reciprocal game for ESPN. So it's a TV issue that could not work.
Yeah. But how are we not rewarding teams? Like, what we're doing is rewarding Michigan and Georgia and saying, you don't have to play anybody at all, and it doesn't matter. As long as you start ahead of teams that play really good teams, you stay ahead of those teams. Which is really just what we're doing here, is saying we're taking data from 2022 season, 2021 season, and putting that on you now in Michigan or Georgia and saying, hey, you get more credit for what happened in 2022 than what Oklahoma's getting credit for what's happened in 2023, which I think is insane.
Yeah. There's a significant chance Georgia's going to end the year without playing any team that ends ranked in the top 25. I know Tennessee and Kentucky right now are sitting there at tied for 19th and then 24th. I don't think Tennessee's a particularly good team, to be honest. And Kentucky is, I think they're pretty good, but I don't know that they're great. They're both going to lose more games. Both of them have to play Alabama. Alabama, with all their faults, is still a much better team than they are. So they're probably not going to end in the top 25. So Georgia's not going to have played a team finished in the top 25. And again, Texas has already played and beat Alabama, which is a much harder team than Georgia's going to play. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I say all that. Let me just say, I had the game pick 34-31 Oklahoma. I feel like that's a pretty good prediction. I don't take anything negative from Texas at all. I think Oklahoma was just badly underranked and underrated because they remember what happened last year, and that's not who they are this year. They're a tremendously improved team that it takes a full offseason every year with a coaching staff to get better. And if you're a Texas fan that feels like all your hopes are dashed, well, one, the way the structure's set up in the Big 12, it really doesn't matter who won this game. It just matters who's going to win the second one. That's by far the more important matchup. And, maybe it makes it a lot harder to get in. I'll buy that. If you lose again to Oklahoma, you're probably out of the playoff with 2 losses now. That's kind of the one caveat. But beyond that, honestly, personally, if we were doing a top 10, which we've kind of stopped doing, I don't know, if you guys hit us up in the comments, if that's something you want to see us do again, let us know, and maybe we'll consider it. But I would probably have them both maybe in my top 5. Certainly wouldn't have them all the way down at ninth. I would have them Texas ahead of a lot of the undefeateds right now, given how they played. And I just think both these teams are really good. And if the 2 top teams in the country play each other, one of them has to be 1-1, or one of them has to lose. It doesn't mean they're bad.
And Josh, what are we doing? Like, can you honestly tell me? Can you honestly tell me that if Georgia was playing Oklahoma or Texas last week and played the way they played against Auburn, they win that game? And look, at neutral field, I'm probably picking Georgia, but rankings are about how you've performed against your schedule. And I just don't see, like, I don't see punishing Texas because Oklahoma hit a near sack pass in the back of the end zone when 10 seconds left in the game. That's crazy to me that we're dumping them 6 spots because of that, when the 2 of the top 3 teams in the country have the luxury of having not played anybody yet. And I'm sorry, I don't think Kentucky's very good. They beat Eastern Kentucky by 11 points. By the way, Oklahoma beat a Cincinnati team that I think beat EKU like 66-10. And I'm not doing a transitive property thing here. I'm just saying I'm not super high on Kentucky. So that's a little frustrating. I want to get in the game a little bit, though. One of the things we talked about and flagged coming into this game was Oklahoma's running backs haven't run the ball well this year. And your whole thing about running quarterbacks is if your quarterback is getting a better yards per carry than your running backs, run him. Like, that's great. Like, you've got an extra blocker maybe, and it just makes sense. What you don't want to do is wear your quarterback out when your running backs are killing it. Well, this game was some more of the same, where the running backs weren't doing great, 3 yards per carry about, but Dylan Gabriel 113 yards, 8 yards a carry. Do you think, one, like, is this sustainable? Like, maybe just that one. Is this sustainable for the Oklahoma offense all year, or for them to win maybe next time against Texas, they've got to find something with the running backs?
I think it is somewhat sustainable to do in rare situations where it's needed. You cannot run your quarterback 14 or 15 times a game and have him stay completely healthy. And the problem with a quarterback, a running back, or especially a lineman or a linebacker, you break a finger in your hand and they just take that thing up like a club, and most of the time you can still play. A quarterback breaks his thumb and he's out for a month and a half. You can't suffer injuries that a lot of other positions constantly suffer. Those linemen constantly have broken fingers, okay? A quarterback, if he breaks one finger in his hand, he's just done most of the time. And that's a problem. And so you can't afford to run him that much. But in a couple games a year when you need to, yeah, you can leverage it. And so I think it's sustainable if this is a one-off. And I will say nothing about this game really shocked me. And we didn't have a lot to say on Twitter, and some people were getting at us on that. It was just hard for me to figure out anything to really comment on because the game went exactly like I kind of thought it would. These are both really good teams. It went back and forth. Gabriel's ability to run the ball, what that really did is it gave them a dimension to their offense to overcome the fact that Texas's interior defensive line is really, really, really good. Like, Sweat and company are hard to run on between the tackles, but Gabriel in the zone read scheme stuff gave him an ability to attack the edges, and so it holds the defensive line in, and you keep running the ball with the running backs because it keeps that defensive line sticking to those assignments, and then you could get isolation with the linebackers and secondary and edge players who I think aren't quite as good. I mean, they have pretty good players there, but that interior defensive line is elite, and the outside guys are merely very good. And that was something they were able to leverage with Gabriel. I also don't know that kind of matchup situation is necessarily going to apply in every single game, but it's nice to have that as a plan B. And I'll go ahead and say it's different to me than another point in the A&M game, which we probably are going to touch on in a minute. Max Johnson ran a lot out of necessity to keep the offense moving, and they're going to have to do that, and that I don't think is going to be sustainable. Gabriel ran as a luxury against a team where they needed it, and they're not going to need that often.
So one takeaway for me, and this is not to diminish what Oklahoma did because, man, they earned that win. This was a slugfest. I don't want to take away anything from that. But one thing that, for me, if I'm Texas and I'm saying, okay, you clean up a couple of things, this game might be a comfortable win for you, which is something to look forward to when they play again, because they're going to play again. The rest of the Big 12 is playing catch-up on these two teams. You had the interception on the first drive, which is, that shouldn't happen. But then you have kind of a fluky interception. It was a good hit, but a fluky interception on the goal line, ready to score. for Texas. So that was a wasted drive. And then you have a goal line stand on the 1 yard line. So there's 2 drives there that you could have come away with 14 points and you came away with 0. And those are huge, not just momentum swings, they're actual swings in the game that are hard to recover from, even if you don't give up like a pick 6. That's really hard to recover from. But those are things that honestly are probably fixable, or honestly don't happen. Those 3 things don't happen in a single game next time. Now, that doesn't mean that, Gabriel probably throws better than 7.5 yards an attempt in the next game or something like that. So again, not taking away from Oklahoma, but just for Texas, if we're looking at a positive for Texas, you can say, man, we clean up a couple of these things and we're back to feeling like reasonably that we're potentially the best team in the country.
Yeah, there were 2 things that we kind of flagged in the preview and caught a little bit of flack from, and they were somewhat related, but it was explosiveness and it was scoring efficiency. So I had noted that in the model, in a lot of ways, Texas was considered to be the superior team, and I can't remember off the top of my head, and I'm probably wrong, but if one way or the other, I know it was at least true that Texas wasn't considered to be getting the same kind of points per yard that Oklahoma was. And I don't remember the exact numbers. Maybe Daniel can do some editing magic and flash that right now. I'm not sure from the older model. But the point I had made, and frankly got mocked a little bit by some Texas fans, was that Texas had a history of consistent inconsistency in red zone scoring. They were throwing away drives on a regular basis all year, and the model sees that. That just continued. So I agree with you that it's a fixable issue, but you need to realize this is not just a one-off. This has been a consistent problem with Texas. It was a problem in their game against Alabama. Otherwise, they would have blown Alabama out. It's been a problem in a lot of the other games, or those would have been blowouts. It happened again. This is not an isolated issue, and I would say the biggest thing that causes that is when a team is a little too finesse. Sark is a brilliant play caller, and he gets guys open, and he creates big chunk plays in the middle of the field. But in a compressed field in the red zone, if you try to be finesse, it's very easy to throw interceptions and to create turnovers. The way to score in the red zone generally is to have a lot of power. You have to be a significant threat to just run the ball to score, and that causes the defense to either give up the run for a touchdown or to go overcompensate and create other opportunities for lower risk. If they can drop players because the safeties don't really have to go very far back, the odds of you having stalls or negative plays go up just tremendously. And sure enough, Texas outgained Oklahoma by about 40 yards. They outgained them per play 6.8 to 6. Same exact third down percentage, 35.7% each, which I find kind of interesting. It was solely the fact that Oklahoma was 6 of 6 in the red zone and Texas was 1 of 3. That was the entire game. But it was actually somewhat predictable. And the second thing I'll note that I flagged that was 100% true, Texas does not consistently hit large explosive plays. And I made the point with viewers, and I know we've made the point a ton of times, this idea that teams like hold back downfield passing for the opportunity when they need it is almost always proven to be a myth. Yeah, maybe one game they hit a couple, in the Alabama game they did. And I had mentioned that it's in some ways a little bit lucky they did that. Well, I think you're kind of seeing it. They didn't have any play over 40 yards in that game. Texas did not have a 40-yard play. And it's going to be a problem because this offense does not consistently produce explosive plays in that level. And if you don't, you have to drive the field, which means you're going to end up in the red zone, which means if you're not good in the red zone, you're not going to score. If Texas didn't have those problems, again, per play, they were better than Oklahoma, but that is part of their identity. Oklahoma, I think it's especially because of Gabriel and his threat to run the ball, gives them a big edge in the red zone, just has an advantage there. And it means until that's fixed, Oklahoma's just going to do a better job of scoring actual points, even if Texas is actually the better team.
So we got to close this out for time. Good discussion, though. Just to tack on to your note, Texas is 122nd in the nation in red zone touchdown conversion percentage. So 64% overall. They're getting to the red zone and they're scoring not 64th. Still not great. Some of that is obviously piled on and gotten worse because of the two yesterday. But TD percent, 122nd. Got to clean that up. All right, Alabama, Texas A&M. This is a game we both picked Texas A&M, and for a while it was looking like it was headed that way. And a lot of people were mad at us because we weren't high on Milroe going in this game. We still had some complaints about him during the game. I think there's a difference between can Alabama win games with Milroe versus can Alabama play to Alabama's standard with Milroe, and that's the big thing. And I'm going to be very positive on Milroe in this discussion. I just wanted to point that out that like Alabama, and you said this to me in the we were chatting with that defense. Alabama wins that game by 3 or 4 touchdowns with any one of the last few quarterbacks they've had. That's just reality. Now, they don't need any one of those quarterbacks this year, probably because football overall is down pretty bad. But talking about this game in particular, my big takeaway from this was, one, when Milroe does get out of his head a little bit and just gets into a flow, which I think that them not running the ball in the second half was actually really good for him. He's pretty good, even on those intermediate throws. 2, Alabama really probably does have the best defense in the country.
Yeah, the defense is so good that it's going to give them a shot against virtually anyone. I mean, Texas A&M only had 306 yards. They only had 5.1 yards per play. 20 points is basically the expected outcome for that kind of yardage. It's not enough yards, not enough per play yardage to be able to sustain many drives. Frankly, that game was probably lucky to not be a bigger blowout than it was, with things like the blocked field goal that didn't get run back. But it's easy to say that's lucky, and that there was, a penalty that was called, which it was a fair penalty, but also a pretty weak one. The bigger point to me is that they couldn't score off that. That was, I think I messaged you at the time and said it's kind of weirdly going to end up being beneficial to Alabama if they do score, because their defense was kind of tired, but they just didn't. And I think that's kind of the reality, right? There's several things that can be true at once. Alabama wins that game by 20-plus points if they still have Bryce Young. 2, Jalen Milroe is right now really the limiter on that football team. 3, Alabama absolutely does not win that game if Jalen Milroe wasn't available.
Right. All those are true.
All 3 of those things can be true. The defense is, if it's not the best, it's easily top 3, but it's probably the best defense in the country. Even banged up, they're there, and that's going to continue through the end of the year. The offense is, I think, underrated in a lot of respects. They had false start issues. Now, a lot of those were on the offensive line. A lot of them weren't. It was also an extremely loud environment, and they're in a clap count, and people always underestimate how difficult it is when it's that loud for a team not to have line issues, because they can't do their normal calls and checks. They can't have a normal snap count cadence, which means the line is constantly having to go off what they hear is this clap or go off motion next to them. You always have a lot more penalties in those situations. It's why it's hard to win on the road in hostile environments. It's not just like total magic dust that happens. But, yeah, I mean, with that defense, as long as they have reasonably good offensive output, this team is going to be really in the playoff hunt all the way through the end of the year. It's just going to be a matter of whether or not they get in a situation where another team gets hot at the wrong time, and whether or not they can respond. I think that's going to determine their season.
Yeah, and people are going to bristle at you saying Bryce Young if he plays yesterday, because they're like, last time they were there, they lost with Bryce Young, but they lost that game 41-38. I think this is also the way Alabama's defense is playing this year, even against teams that aren't great offensively, is a huge referendum on what Pete Golding did at Alabama, which was not great. And I think what we're seeing is what we said all along. He had such wealth of talent that they could coach down and still have good numbers and still hold really bad teams to low scores, but you could just see it and you could just feel it. And the way that Alabama defense is playing this year is how they should have been playing the last 2 years. And I actually think it probably cost them a championship. Even with Bill O'Brien there, who I didn't think did a great job, I think they win a national championship in one of those 2 years. I saw A&M fans were pretty upset at the game yesterday. I think they were very excited. There's a lot of media behind them, including us, saying that they were probably going to win the game. They could have won that game. I think my takeaway from that game is not that Texas is bad. It's that Alabama is better than I thought, because Milroe was able to get in a groove in the second half offensively, especially without being able to run the ball. I thought they got really good play at quarterback, and I've seen a lot of Texas A&M fans grumbling. Man, he pulled Johnson pulled some throws out of his ass with falling backwards, had 3 guys on top of him, dropping dimes. I think he did it 2 or 3 times. One of them was for that big, like, 40-yard play. You know, we're talking about Alabama's defense. That was a fluke play that contributed to the 300 yards that they gave up and points. I thought A&M played really well yesterday. The only weakness I see right now is probably that secondary.
Well, so we're going to get demonetized for 2 reasons. One, you said Texas instead of Texas A&M, and then 2, you said the A word. I'm not sure which of those is a more deadly sin. No, Max Johnson was 9.6 yards per attempt. He's only 56% passing, which, again, isn't great because it's hard to sustain. But he was under constant pressure throughout the game. And he made a lot of sandlot football plays. And I made the comment where I think Jimbo Fisher doesn't like Max Johnson because he doesn't really run their offense correctly or well. There are a lot of things he doesn't do well pre-snap or post-snap. But he makes plays when they're there. And there were some pressure situation, shovel pass, first down plays Alabama absolutely wasn't making in that game. I think anybody that's really upset with him misses the point, because I thought he did basically everything that was really apparent for him to do. And he had 1 or 2 gaffes on his part, but I actually thought he played at a very, very high level. Frankly, I thought he was probably better than Wegman would have been in that same game. Wegman does not have great pocket awareness. We've talked about that. The whole thing with corner blitz is getting him the same way I'm about to transition to with Alabama is an issue. He's a more instinctive player, and against Alabama's pass rush, I think they would have had issues with Wegman. Now, Wegman will be the better quarterback against teams, especially like in a shootout, where Johnson probably won't be because he's a little more inconsistent just in terms of a pure passer. I think you'd rather have Wegman when you play LSU, but that's a little down the road. But in this game, he was better. The problem for these teams, and it's funny because I think it's hard to see, it's actually a lot of it is pre-snap. So something I noted, and we were discussing, when I went back and looked at Alabama's, they had 6 sacks and a lot of the A&M sacks. The majority of the sacks in this ball game are coming through call and protection issues. I know I went back and looked because somebody asked me to, at the 6 sacks Alabama had just in a highlight video. 3 of the 6 were bad protection calls, 2 of which were just strictly the wrong protection call was called. So a guy is allowed to come as a free rusher. That is usually on the quarterback to do pre-snap, sometimes not. It's too hard for the linemen to be able to see the edges to change those. So it's usually the quarterback, sometimes a running back, sometimes a line, but usually on the quarterback to do a slide protection or something so you make sure everybody gets accounted for, and then the back fills. Those weren't called. Same problem with Texas A&M. Max Johnson does not handle that, and that's what I talk about in running the offense. What's interesting, the offensive line really wasn't that responsible for too many on either team. The Alabama side, when we went through it, really only one clear instance where it's on the line. It was one on the back, getting beat, 2 on a bad protection call, and then 2 more that were really not great protection calls. That were a mix of execution issues, but it's the pre-snap mental stuff that's holding both of these teams back. It's the pre-snap mental stuff, particularly for Alabama, that's keeping them from being a better team. They have a new quarterback. It takes a while for any new quarterback to get better at that. They will continue to get better at it. They will continue to probably have less penalties. And that makes me think this Alabama team in particular is going to get a lot better. And I think the problem with A&M is I think Max Johnson is who he is. And so this is gonna be who Texas A&M is, and it's probably going to translate better against a worse defense, which is everyone else will play. But for Alabama, I think they're still only really scratching the surface of what they can be as a football team. Jalen Milroe, when he throws the ball, he's actually a very good passer. He's pretty accurate. He has a tremendous amount of arm strength. He has pretty good timing on his throws. It's not fantastic. The interception was a late throw. Wasn't helped by a snap, but pretty good. But the biggest thing for them is they're not always pre-snap in the right set for what they need to be doing. And because of that too, Milroe doesn't always identify from the coverage perspective where his first read is. Like, he does his progressions, but he may not read where they need to start from first, if that makes sense. So the read determines the order of progression, and he goes through the progression, but often not starting in the right spot. the better they get at that, and the more confident he gets to throw the ball, once he knows where he needs to throw and he throws it, he's actually a pretty good quarterback. It's just there's a pretty good ways they got to get there, and the closer they get there, the higher their much better the offense is going to be. It's just a matter of how far they can progress in that
think
regard.
that the big thing that Milroe's got to touch up is the short throws, not even the intermediate throws. The intermediate throws and the boundary throws he made yesterday were great, short and long. He had a couple of throws where, like, a design throw the back out of the backfield. He had the throw to Niblack that was high. There were a lot of false starts on 3rd and long, but they were in 3rd and long because Milroe missed the easy throws. He missed the easy throw on the last drive of the game where I think Benson was wide open, uncovered. That was just a...
There were back-to-back possessions in that game where Milroe missed a 5 to 7 yard short throw for a first down on 2nd down, and then they false started on 3rd, and then they took a sack after the false start. And it's easy to look at the false start and the sack, but you miss. In both of those instances, they had a wide open guy on 2nd down that was an overthrow that set up the 3rd down. That it's all interrelated. Yeah.
And if you're an Alabama fan, you can be encouraged because he misses the throw to Burton around the end zone, and he's wide open. But then the very next play, I think it's like 3rd and 14 or something in the red zone, which is a hard thing to convert. And he drops an absolute seed off his back foot in the back corner of the end zone for a touchdown. So, and the other big one was the emergence. It was either a slant or a really tight post for the other touchdown. There's some things that are evolving here that you really would hope to see in week 1 or week 2. And that goes back to your complaint about how they mishandled the whole quarterback thing. Like, they should have named Milroe QB1 at the beginning of fall camp, got all the QB1 reps. Didn't happen, and we're seeing him come along, but some of it is probably because of who he is, and some of it is because of how it was mismanaged. Looking at the 2 schedules for these 2 teams, and I know we got to move on, my big thing for A&M right now is they're a good football team. If they can just hold on and not lose the locker room, not have a mutiny against Jimbo, play for the rest of the season. And this is the problem with playing for, like, winning the West or winning titles or whatever, is if you're not a championship team, if you're not elite, and you have that first or second loss, you have the potential to fall off a cliff. They can win every single game left on their schedule. It's actually not that bad. The matchups for them are very good. I think at Tennessee is going to be tough because it's going to be a raucous environment. South Carolina's winnable. Ole Miss is winnable. Mississippi State, obviously. LSU, I think, is a bad matchup, like, for LSU, just because of how bad their defense is. All these games are winnable, right? So I think Texas A&M, if they don't lose that locker room, they can still have a great season. For Alabama, it's also true that everything is in front of them and they can win every game, but this is a brutal stretch. At Texas A&M, Arkansas, who's not great but has the ability to stress you with their offense, then Tennessee, off week LSU, Kentucky, and then you finish at Auburn. Like, none of those teams jump off the page at you saying that's a team that beats an Alabama. But as we always say, when you have 3 or 4 decent teams in a clump together, you might drop one of those games. I think both of these teams have the chance to win out. I think both of these teams will each lose at least one more.
I don't think that's an unrealistic take, and it's just generally a realistic take when you have multiple tough games. And I'll say I don't think it's that easy to play at away like Texas A&M is. Away at Tennessee, at Ole Miss, at LSU. It's rough how that falls. Now I think A&M is going to get a boost because Tennessee being ranked. Frankly, I've already said this. I think it's a little bit of a joke. I don't think they're that good. They should not be ranked right now, in my opinion, and it's silly to me that they're ranked in Florida. Florida is not. But they beat Tennessee, kind of changes the momentum. South Carolina's not a great team, and then you end the year with two big away games, Ole Miss and LSU. And LSU is going to be tough because they are going to put everybody they play probably in a shootout. And as I said, Max Johnson's maybe not the best quarterback for a shootout. I think Wegman would have been better there. But you got all season to really gel, get where you need to get, and play those games. So everything's in front of both of these teams. A lot of games left to play. Obviously, Alabama getting this win puts them ahead of the 8 ball, and having played Ole Miss already. But yeah, I mean, these are two good teams, and I think, frankly, I get why they're ranked where they're ranked, but I also don't. I think they're from an overall perspective, they're underranked, and they're likely to end up higher than they are right now, especially Texas A&M. So it's going to be interesting to see how the rest of the year plays out.
All right, so real quick, 2 more games because we are time limited. We don't want to run a recap for an hour because nobody will watch it. Maryland, Ohio State. That game was like ugly and weird. It was closer than the 17-37. I think we're seeing yet again, though, that and I know you've got your issues with Taulia Tagovailoa. I get it. Like, I know that. I do too. I have a lot of issues with how they called that game at the end of the game. But really, all of that aside, I think we've got enough data to really confirm that Ohio State has a very, if not elite, a very good defense this year.
Yeah, I think it's virtually impossible to argue otherwise. And they, let me be clear. When the start of that game, Maryland was putting up pretty good yardage, and they had to settle down. The one thing I'll say is I'm going to harken back to stuff I said on the previews about these two teams and how I thought it would go. And it's nice to do previews and then talk about it afterwards because I think it gives a little more credibility that I'm not just talking in hindsight. Maryland's scheme is so RPO driven that sometimes teams aren't really in sync. And early in that game, Ohio State wasn't completely in sync to stop it. But they settled down. And like you said, I think they have at least a very good defense, if not an elite one. And they kind of clamped down on those throws. They're able to crowd the lanes. The athleticism came into play. And they just shut Maryland down. That game ended the way it did because Maryland stopped being able to score and move the football. Ended it 4 yards per play and 298 yards after having moved the ball pretty well into the third quarter and then just stopping. The problem I have really, though, is that Maryland has way too much of a tendency to do this. I think Loxley's scheme, if you're playing it correctly and you're athletic enough to play it correctly, can just be flat out shut down. And my concern with Taulia, which proved 100% true, I think Taulia is a very talented passer. He is an underrated athlete. He is inconsistent, sometimes bordering on erratic. He's not particularly accurate. He's a good quarterback. He's not necessarily an accurate quarterback. Can make every throw, doesn't make every throw. He's inconsistent with decisions. And once they get down, sometimes they kind of, when he goes to create, it often feels like panic mode. And then there's no doubt in this game, the second half, he was kind of in panic mode, created some huge negative plays that turned the course of the game and turned it to Ohio State. We both picked Ohio State in this game by comfortable margins. I picked them pretty big. Frankly, I was 100% right on why. Their athleticism took over. Maryland ended up struggling with their base offensive scheme. That offense does not have a counterpunch. And so I completely agree with you. I think Ohio State showed they have a very good defense. But I will also say, as predicted, once you shut down the thing that Maryland really wants to do, they don't have a plan B. And that's what we saw. And I think you're going to see that with everybody they play. And it makes it a little hard for me to want to take too much from it because what I saw was exactly what I expected to see. And it felt like it was for exactly the reasons I thought it was going to be. So I'll stop short. I'll stop right at just saying Ohio State showed they have a very good defense and an offense that could take a step when they needed to. And again, I don't think if anybody wants to blame McCord, I think you're just 100% wrong. McCord is not the problem with Ohio State. It's the line of scrimmage. But yeah, I mean, Ohio State took another step forward to showing that they can at least become the team they need to be this year to reach the goals they want to hit.
Yeah, I think that the issue for me is with Ohio State, they're somewhat in the same boat as Alabama in that I think that Ohio State's got a good offense. I don't think it's an elite offense, but they have a good defense. They have had some slow starts, and they can't afford that against a really, really good team. They can't have a slow start against a Michigan or a Penn State because I feel like this is the first time in a long time Ohio State's probably going to win games with defense and can win against elite teams with defense. But this is the first time in a long time I've felt like they're not equipped to dig themselves out of a 13-point hole.
Yeah. No, I think that's probably true. And Again, that offensive line still isn't impressing. They did not run the ball well on Maryland. And if they're in a position where they've really got to throw, that line is going to get exposed. Right now, they are running the ball to keep the other defense honest because the line can't really hold up. And yeah, I don't know how sustainable that is, but that's just where they're at as a football team, and they are going to have to lean on the defense to hit the goals they want to hit.
All right, one last game I want to talk about for a minute because I think it sort of contributes to our future look of the landscape, at least in the SEC. I got a note for you, Josh, on Missouri's offense. Put up 39 points yesterday on LSU, had the ball with a chance to win or tie, gave up a pick six. So the score is not representative of how that game went. It was a 3-point win basically for LSU. Josh, this is who Missouri has played so far this year. South Dakota, Middle Tennessee, Kansas State, Memphis, Vandy, and LSU. They had their highest yards per play of the season in any game they've played this year except for the Memphis game against LSU. There are real material foundational problems with this LSU defense. It may not matter. We might be in Lincoln Riley territory where you can outscore everybody. But right now you've got to be a little bit concerned at how sustainable it is in this era of football, now that we're kind of post-RPO everything, that they can beat everybody 45-40.
Yeah. Someone who wasn't me but will remain nameless put out a tweet about Missouri's schedule, and I was like, all right, now we're just doomed. And I was like, oh man, you really want to put that much faith in LSU to put out a negative tweet on Missouri? No, there are material problems with LSU, and I put out the tweet later, noting one, Brady Cook is the best QB that people haven't heard of or followed. In our metrics, he's consistently been like a top 5, top 10 quarterback. And those are opponent adjusted stuff that we do, which is pretty cool. Go to collegefootballnerds.com and you look at the relative performance statistic, which just says how much better or worse are you against the teams you've played than everybody else against the teams you've played, adjusting for all the different scheduling quirks. It's just a different way of looking at statistics rather than absolute numbers. And Brady Cook is phenomenal in that regard, and it showed in that game. Now, his numbers, 8.4 yards per attempt, didn't look that great. They struggled late in the game, I would say. I'm going to note against LSU's zone. But to that point, LSU switching to zone is a concession that they do not have the talent to run man coverage. Their guys are getting cooked. They're getting beat. And the other thing is they were struggling with Missouri's run game in man coverage because you get your back turned. And Missouri was able to get past the line of scrimmage and they would get huge chunks. So they had to go to zone to make up for the talent issues they have in the back seven and to keep their eyes to the quarterback and to the run game to be able to crash on it. That's not good. That's a concession that says we don't have the personnel, not really an adjustment any more than that. Give them credit for realizing that, but that's not something that's sustainably going to create a great defense. That's just going to make a bad defense more manageable. There's a lot of little wrinkles here, and we hadn't done much, frankly, on LSU preseason because I had concerns. And I'll be honest, we spend so much time on so many different teams, and doing videos where I'm going to be more negative isn't always the best use of our time. But if you look at Mason Smith, right, who came into this year with a tremendous amount of hype because of his injury situation previously. Well, in 2021, he had 4 sacks. 3 of those sacks came in the McNeese State game. He only had 1 sack the rest of the year. You look at his tackles for loss statistics in 2021, same kind of deal. 5 tackles for loss, 3.5 came against McNeese State. There is a lot of unfounded hype about this LSU team. A lot about a guy in Smith that was coming back from injury, probably will be a better player down the road, probably not really who he should be right now. Wingo cannot be that team by himself. The linebackers are not great. Spate getting hurt doesn't help. The secondary, expecting a secondary that was, by the way, very average last year with transfers, to have complete turnover and be above average this year was completely unrealistic. The offense is quite good. Jaden Daniels is, in my opinion, right now the best quarterback in the SEC. Not sure it's close. The receiving core has been better than I expected and are consistently getting wins. The offensive line has been quite good. That defense is terrible. and it's going to be a limiter. Every game's going to be a shootout. They could lose any game on the schedule the entire rest of the year because of how bad that defense is. Same deal with like the Arkansas game. Same deal with the way the Ole Miss game went late. It's going to be them the entire year. So it's really hard to see this LSU team not dropping another game, maybe even another couple games. And I'll say we're not going to do a preview on it, but that includes Auburn next week because this team, the same team that just went into that Missouri game and gave up, I'm looking at the rushing yards, 8.8 yards per carry, 114 yards on 13 carries to Schrader. I know he had a 52-yarder, but you take that out, it's still 5-6 yards per play. Pete had 4.5 yards per carry. Auburn may be able to mostly run the ball every play and do well, and I think that LSU secondary is so bad they're still going to be able to throw some. I mean, every game is losable for LSU the rest of the year, and that's a genuine problem.
Yeah, and LSU's like a 15-point favorite or something like that, but like I said, they still could lose every single game. All right, y'all, that's it for us on this kind of big weekend of football wrapped. This upcoming week is not quite as big, so we wanted to make sure that we touched on it as we moved on. Y'all remember, like and subscribe. Helps us out a ton. Check out collegefootballnerds.com and let us know in the comments what you think Alabama and Texas A&M's records will be at the end of the regular season. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.